Okay, everybody, appreciate you guys coming and welcome to the panel on ethical use of data and AI applications. And I'm going to do a brief presentation to introduce the panel and the panelists, and then we'll start from there. Okay, the focus of this panel, right? What we are going to talk about is ethical data. How do we get ethical data? Why are we using it for your AI applications? Why is that important? As we know, data is what I call the new currency, right? Data is the lifeblood of all AI applications. It starts with data. And if you do not have ethical data when you start the process of training and testing your algorithms, you will have bad results. So it's always start with the data. So we're going to get more involved and talking more about that with your esteemed panelists. So let's start with the panelists. Myself, I'm the moderator. My name is Dr. Anthony Rim. We out and about talking. You can call me Tony. Um, I've been in at IT since the 90s and in AI since the 90s. And many people don't even know that AI was around then, but yes, it was, and it was something that was was around even before then. And so I run a consulting practice, and our push is in the AI and knowledge management space. And I also have opportunity to write a few books and many articles in AI and knowledge management. So I'll be asking questions, and I want to encourage the audience to ask questions as well to our panelists. Our first panelist is Katrina Ingram. She is the founder and CEO of Ethically Aligned AI, a company focused on better outcomes in the design, development, and deployment of AI systems. And you guys can read more about her too. She's in the program and online on the conference website. Our next panelist is Sunil Soares, and he is the founder and CEO of YDC, which focuses on AI governance. And prior to this role, Sunil was the founder and CEO of Information Asset, a data management firm, which he sold to private equity. He's another great panelist. And also we'll have Kira Rodate, right? She is a data scientist, lead staff data scientist at the TriNet Group. And she brings over a decade of expertise in data analytics, data science, establishing herself as a thought leader in the AI industry. So you know we have these esteemed panelists that we're going to dive into this subject matter. So I'm going to give you guys just a brief overview, kind of get us kind of moving in the direction of this ethical use of data for AI applications. A little history of this. I wrote a chapter on this subject, and it appears in my latest book, Essential Topics in Artificial Intelligence. And so when I presented the idea of doing something here at the conference, Tony Shaw, he thought, well, this would be a good panel discussion. So I said, okay, well, help me find some panelists. And here we are. So if you can Google this ethical use of data AI applications, and you will find that chapter, and you can take a deep dive into that. So the key points that we're going to focus on in our conversations, and I want you guys to jump into this, is the bias in AI systems, data ethics principles, diverse AI teams, data governance. We talk about data governance, responsible AI use, data ethics, AI ethics, And it's a big pool, and sometimes we just lump it all in data governance. But there are distinct things that we need to do in order to facilitate those things. So also, we can also talk about challenges in the ethical AI. So with that in mind, let's start the panel discussion. First question for the panel. What does ethical use of data in AI mean to you? And why is it critical for organizations to prioritize this?
Do you want me to jump in on that?
Anybody, yes, jump on in.
I'm happy to. Welcome, everyone. So nice that you're here. Thanks for joining us. We have like a super big room, but I feel like we're going to have an intimate conversation anyways. So yeah, so I think this issue, first of all, I just want to acknowledge that I'm glad that we're having this conversation about ethics and governance. I've been working in this space since 2018, and when I first started working in this space, I can tell you that we weren't necessarily having that conversation yet. There was a lot of knocking on doors to get to the point to have this conversation. So I just want to kind of acknowledge, first of all, and you have it in the title of your book, Tony, essential. I think this is an essential thing that we be talking about ethics, we talking about governance, and we talk about the role of data in all of that. So I just kind of wanted to put that out there first and foremost. So for me, a lot of this is about how do we do the right things? How do we act responsibly? How do we do things well? And sometimes that means, that we have laws to tell us what to do. It's really nice when that happens. And sometimes it means we're not quite sure yet what that means, and we need to have deeper conversations about it. And that's a lot of the work that I do, is kind of facilitating those conversations, holding up these situations where things maybe haven't gone as well, and figuring out how do we do better. So when I think about this topic, those are the things that come to mind for me.
Okay, Kira.
All right. So I have an expanded view on that, because that's absolutely true, is that a lot of times when we talk about ethical AI, everybody goes, well, what's the regulation? What is the government saying? What is the state saying? Which is important. But as someone who develops the AI models, it's also very important for me to understand, where does my data come from? Has there been transparency in that, the fact that we are collecting this data, the models I choose and how I train it? Is it fair? Can I evaluate it? Can I be able to stand in front of a business or a regulatory committee and tell them exactly how this model got this insight? If I can't do that, that's not very ethical. It's not very fun, as I like to say, because it really is about understanding and being able to be transparent and to be fair. And that is really why a lot of companies should care about ethical AI, especially today. There's so many black box models where people say, just put your data in and something will happen. And then we see later all of the harm that comes from doing that, right? And ethical AI is really about limiting and minimizing that harm. And if we're not sure what the harm is, opening it up to a larger discussion with people from other backgrounds and different viewpoints as well.
Yeah, so ethical AI encompasses bias, transparency, privacy, security. And there's a challenge in terms of what the regulations tell you to do. But sometimes just because you can do it from a regulatory standpoint doesn't mean you should do it. So from an ethical standpoint, opt-in versus opt-out. So if you look at the terms of use of a lot of these applications now that are embedding AI, all these applications, companies are getting pushed by their investors. You've got to add AI. You've got to improve your valuation, add AI. So you start looking at the terms of use carefully under data privacy, and some attorney very carefully added in some clause around terms of use, which is pretty much they can use your data to train their AI models. It's legal because it's disclosed, but is it ethical? I don't know, right? It's not necessarily governed very well by a regulation. So that would be one aspect as well.
Okay. Any questions from the audience? Okay, keep thinking. Something to come to you. Okay, I want to move into something else. When we talk about ethics, we also talk about transparency and explainability. How is that accomplished in AI solution development? How is explainability and transparency accomplished? Anybody? Sunil?
Everybody's looking at me. Okay. So there's a lot of different, what I call levers we can pull, right? There's a lot of things that start with the data. Is this data, has it been captured correctly? Has there been consent given? Have we informed the people that we are collecting data on? And then as we are going and developing our features, right, there's a lot of documentation about why we chose these features. It's very easy to say, oh, this is highly correlated with success, whatever success is in the model, but what does that actually mean? Are we thinking about how that could impact people, how that could impact maybe another group? Is our data actually taken and we trained on something that is equal to all types of the possibilities within this? Are we being biased by excluding something that maybe affects a certain group? In addition, when we consider Gen AI, right, there's a whole lot around that, around just understanding that when we evaluate generative models, it is predictive. How do we then go back and say, okay, one time we may get a very questionable answer, but 99% of the time we don't? How do we limit that? And a lot of that is writing things down, making sure that we produce model cards, making sure that we have notes and decisions documented. A lot of my job beyond just playing with data and having fun is writing things down and making sure that I have produced artifacts for the business to go back and be able to figure out why I chose what I chose, how was it affected, what did I do to make sure that there was no bias? And then when we go to deployment, we are constantly monitoring anything that we deploy. We have alerts that let us know if there's model drift. And then also, what does model drift look like, right? Are we accepting 10%? Are we accepting 2%? What is the impact of that? And it's not just financial, right? It's easy to say as a corporation or any client, hey, this model shifts 5%. That's a huge effect to our revenue. But what if it affects 2% and it only affects in a certain group? We also have to make sure that whatever we're doing, we're also monitoring the way our data is behaving in production and how is it being affected by constant real data.
I just want to pick up on that word transparency as well, because sometimes it can be as simple as you're dealing with an AI disclosure, right? I mean, I think this is going to become more and more important as we see more instances of AI systems out there. Just knowing that we're actually dealing with an AI system, or AI was used to generate this kind of content or this kind of image, that sort of thing. So I think there is that aspect of it too, which is it's very non-technical. There's nothing really technical about that. It's just disclosing the use of it.
Exactly.
So there's transparency and there's explainability, and sometimes you can conflate them, but they're actually different. So with the NIST, for example, the AI RMF, Risk Management Framework, transparency, and even the EU AI Act, as Katrina said, when you're dealing with a AI system, you're supposed to disclose that you're dealing with an AI system unless it's obvious. So that's transparency. And then there's explainability, which is I got a result. Do I know why I got that result, right? So those are two aspects of transparency and explainability.
All right, I'm going to stay with Sunil for a second. Our current regulations, like the GDPR and the EU AI Act, are those regulations sufficient in governing AI solutions?
Oh, that's a very interesting question. We had a discussion this morning in the panel as well. So the GDPR is a Venn diagram, if you think about it, relative to the EU AI Act. And for those of you who are familiar with what's happening in Europe, there's DORA, Digital Operating Resiliency Act, NIS2, they're all overlapping. But if you think about it, the GDPR is very focused on, obviously, data privacy. And then the EU AI Act is obviously focused on AI. But in the US, we're taking more of a sectoral approach. So, you have bespoke regulations that affect AI. But I love it because the GDPR, for example, says you cannot use certain categories of data at all. You can't, for example, use someone's political affiliation. But the EU AI Act says you cannot discriminate based on certain categories. So then the regulator said, hold on a second. We have to draft 10(2)(f)(g) of the EUA Act that says, actually, you can collect, it's called the debiasing exception, you can collect certain categories of data to ensure that you're not discriminating. Does that make sense? So the GDPR says you cannot collect it. The EUA Act says you should for the limited purpose of making sure that you actually comply. So
It's I don't know if any of you guys know the panel. The IEEE has a certified
AI ethics assessment.
AI access
I
program.
took it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and so did I, and I'm now certified as a lead AI assessor. And so that brings up a great point because when we come in and assess algorithms, we're looking at the organization and how they're using it. And so some bias may be okay. Certain bias may be okay within the use of that algorithm, depends on what it is. And so part of the evaluation for that and using the IEEE framework and working with the organization, because the organization is going to help guide the analysis, you take that into consideration. Because when we come into your organization, for instance, and we want to assess your algorithm, I look at it like this. You say what you do what you say, and then you prove it. So we are going to march through that algorithm and all the processes, the explainability, the transparency, who did what, who programmed this, who said that, who gave you this, and look for that evidence. You say you did this, show me and prove it how you do it. So it may be simple, but we take a deep dive into these things, and it's not some AI program doing the assessment. It's actually people working with other people in the organization to undertake a deep crawl through that algorithm, right, to understand it. And so if your algorithm passes the assessment, we then recommend it to the IEEE so it can be, I call it the housekeeping seal of approval. You know, your algorithm is then, if they accept it, is approved as an ethical algorithm. So that is a huge bonus for an organization wanting to establish their AI practices and what they are putting out to the public as being ethical. And so we have all these frameworks and things like that to understand and apply, but it's working with the organization to understand these are things you have to do in order to produce algorithms that can be used by the public. So
I wanna pick up on something you said there. I think this is really important. And so when I talk to audiences about bias, I don't think it's really bias that we're concerned about. I think what we're concerned about is fairness and justice. So we're concerned about the fact that we don't want people to be treated unfairly, unjustly, discriminated against. And bias is kind of a way that we're having this conversation to make sure that we're not doing those things, right? And so I think when I think about what is the core value that's kind of underpinning this conversation around algorithmic bias, I really think it's more about fairness and justice.
right, because if you really take a look at it, we all have biases. All right. So I've worked with companies that the IT department had biases on what software that they would bring in. We don't like that vendor. They never respond when I call them. So we don't bring their software in. They may be the best software for you, but I don't want that. And so those biases, trickle down to everything you do. But we have to kind of step back and say, to your point, what is fair? Are we hurting any certain groups with what we're developing? And kind of, remove our own innate biases from different things, right? I also worked with a company that brought in a algorithm for their HR, for hiring. And so, because they wanted to expand the group of people that they were bringing in for a certain position. However, the data that they used to train the algorithm was historical data. So they kept getting the same people, the same outcome. I said, well, the first thing I asked, what kind of data you used? If you're using historical data that you use that really tells you what type of person you've already been hiring, the algorithm is just going to perpetuate that and say, well, you're going to continue to hire those group of people. You got to diversify the data set. So that's where the data is so important. Another example where that comes in at. So it's those things that we kind of step outside the box and understand, what we need to do in order to accomplish the goals of the algorithm being used. Come on, audience. Any questions from the audience? No? You guys still good? All right. So I got another question. Of course, I got a whole lot of questions here. This is to the panel. How can organizations prepare for emerging ethical challenges in AI, such as risk posed by agentic systems, different generative AI systems? We talked a little bit about that. So how can organizations prepare for that emerging ethical challenges? Katrina, let's start with you.
Yeah, there's so many. Where to start with this? Maybe I'll start with a recommendation. So there's this fantastic podcast called Shell Game, and it's all about this reporter who decides to create an AI digital doppelganger. Because you mentioned agentic AI, right? And so he creates this version of himself, and he sends it out in the world to do all these things, like go talk to different sources and so forth. He doesn't tell them what he's doing. And it just raises all of these questions, of course, like the ethics around, misrepresenting yourself that way. And so this is where we're quickly going. I bring this up because, as much as it's a challenge to live in the world that we live in right now with everything LLM and ChatGPT and generative AI, we're kind of moving down this pathway very quickly when it comes to what does it mean to have agents in the world. And so I think part of what we can do is education. So I'm a huge proponent of education, awareness, and the kinds of things that we're doing right now in terms of building these topics into conferences and having these conversations is super important. But I think it's also important for all of us as we kind of move down this pathway to kind of level up our skill set. So that's kind of one practical thing. I'll leave it there and allow some of the other members to jump in on this.
Yeah, I agree with you. AI agents. So we all talk about AI governance, for example, and AI ethics. We have to have a human in the loop. But the whole point with AI agents is you remove the human from the loop. So Sam Altman from OpenAI said one day, and I don't know if he's right or wrong, I have no idea, said one day there'll be a person running $1 billion company with no employees except himself or herself. How are you going to have a human in the loop at that point, right? So I think it's important to immerse yourself in the technology a little bit like this person did by sending agents out into the world. And then understanding potentially regulations are important. So understanding how some of these emerging regulations, case studies can have an impact. So for example, we talked about hiring bias. Workday was sued a little while ago because someone decided, well, Workday's hiring agents are being embedded in all these different systems. So there's implicit bias potentially. So now thinking how that might apply to the world with AI agents is valuable.
I think I have probably some practical advice, which is don't chase the shiny object. Yes, I like shiny objects. I'm wearing a shiny jacket. I play in data. I'm a data scientist. I love cool things that are happening in the world. But you have to understand practically what you want to do with the shiny object. Agent AI is a really, really great example. It is amazing for productivity, but what is the risk when that AI agent goes and starts talking to a customer and promises them, yes, you can get our services for $1? What happens when that is compromised? Someone is able to hack into your system. What happens, when the public gets a hold of it and we see what happens on any kind of social media with AI? It kind of goes a little wonky. It's a little interesting. You have to understand what you are trying to do with this and understand the inherent risks and understand the world that this is going to go and play in, right? If you're exposing it to people, do you have guardrails? Do you have the ability to make sure it is not going to affect somebody inadequately? Can you make sure that if someone can't use it because they cannot read or they do not see because it's in a certain color, that when it pops up, how do you address that? But also, how do you address that every single response is going to be a certain kind of response? So understanding and really cementing what you want to do with a shiny object really helps kind of mitigate a lot of that ethical concern and also talk to everybody. I'm your friendly neighborhood data scientist. I love to talk to people. Talk to your compliance, your privacy, your risk, your lawyers, talk to your data engineers. Have that conversation because other people may have a different opinion on the shiny idea that you're trying to implement and say, hey, did you consider this? And having that conversation, as Katrina mentioned, is so important, especially in any area of ethics.
Okay. Something that's really bothered me for a while about AI and how people are perceiving how data is used in AI. When folks say, "Well, the AI was hallucinating," and I said, "It's hallucinating? What do you mean hallucinating?" So, question to the panel: how does data play in preventing these hallucinations by AI solutions?
I don't like the term hallucination. I'll just put that out there right away. So, before I answer that, I think part of what's going on here is we don't have good language for talking about what's really going on. And so then somebody picks up a term, it gets widely covered, and then that becomes the meaning of the term. So hallucination, what that means now is that ChatGPT or some generative AI system gave us some information that is inaccurate or exhibits some kind of bias. It's problematic in some way. But if you think about what are generative AI systems really good at, what are they designed for, is to create that stochastic novel piece of content based on a whole bunch of probability and computation. And so there's no intent to, there's no hallucination going on. It really is just doing what it kind of does, but from our perspective, it's not accurate. So that is what I mean by this term kind of coming in and then it takes over and now that's what we call a hallucination. I have noticed some people try and reframe it as a confabulation, which is maybe a bit better, but I think the bigger issue is that we don't really have good language to talk about these issues yet.
So the enterprise's data, if you're using RAG, retrieval augmented generation, a lot of the retrieval augmented generation would be around unstructured data, which, as data governance professionals, we don't do a good job governing. So if you're exposing all those PDFs, for example, in some type of RAG framework for the customer service department to go issue a query, and you got conflicting policies in different PDF documents, that's probably going to get exposed when you're using a chatbot on top of all your unstructured documents.
Yep. And I think along with that is there's a technical side to it. And then there's also your own internal bias. What is a hallucination? Myself and 10 other people can sit in a room, right, and argue, well, this isn't exactly correct. Well, what does that mean? Are we arguing over peanuts or are we arguing over a full 5-course meal, right? So really understanding what does that mean in the context that you are developing in. Does that mean it is factually incorrect? Does that mean that it is ethically incorrect to say that? Does it mean that it is implementing some sort of bias or I cannot say that word today. Or is it?
Perturbation.
Thank you. See, my LLM died. Is it continuing to push forth something that is just incorrect? Now I have hair in my face. This is fun. So understanding that and being able to actually go ahead and have that conversation and be able to outline it, right? Then there's the technological aspect of it, right? RAG, okay, we can do that unstructured, structured documents. We can put that on tabular data. We can put that on a whole bunch of different data sets. We can add search semantic guardrails. We can add true or false guardrails. We can even have LLM as a judge and have the LLM judge the LLM's choice of, is this correct? Was this summarized correct? All of that goes into saying, what is correctness?
Yeah, and for me, the other question I sit with is, why do we want a probabilistic tool to give us something deterministic? Why why do we use the butter knife to put together our furniture? And I get it. It's attractive. People are telling us how great the butter knife is. It does all these things. Everybody wants to use it everywhere. But this is the kind of thing I think, again, like kind of taking the non-technical, but maybe more the business approach. Why? Is it the right tool for the job? Because then we wind up doing all of these other things to kind of correct that it's not doing exactly what we want it to do. And then we get even more complexity in our system. So I think we're kind of sitting with all of that like a year, 2 years into this experiment and going, is this maybe the right approach or not?
Oh, okay, yeah. Because I never really liked that hallucination thing. That always bothered me. It's wrong. It's not. So somebody's going to ask me, well, I thought you was wrong. I mean, this what you told me is not correct. I'm saying, oh, I was hallucinating. So you can't blame me for that, right? I never liked that anyway. So the one thing I've talked to a lot of organizations about customers is at the beginning of an AI solution journey. And so I have a question around to the panel, of course. How important is team diversity in addressing AI bias, and what strategies can organizations use to ensure diverse perspectives? Anybody want to go first?
So I think the question is, what do you mean by diversity? Is it diversity of ethnicity, gender?
That's great.
Is it diversity of thought? So clearly, everyone is in this room who's doing AI governance or AI ethics probably has some type of board or council. So by definition, you've got somebody from marketing, you've got somebody from finance, technology. So you have that diversity, you have diversity of thought. You probably need other types of diversity too, right?
Right. So absolutely. So when I talk about diverse teams, Sunil, you're absolutely correct. I talk about diversity of thought. So you need folks from different fields, different perspectives, different experiences to be a part of your team. I once talked to a organization that had a cognitive psychologist on their team that looked at their models from a whole different perspective I would have never thought about. And so that was part of their diversity. But it's also diversity of culture, because when it comes to data and what the information that you're using, one culture may say, oh, that's fine, but another culture say, well, in the context of what we're using this for, this may have some issues, especially if you're a multinational organization or global company and you have your AI solutions in different countries. You really have to pay attention to some of these cultural things as well. So anybody else want to jump in on that?
No, I think that's absolutely right. And it's also overcoming your own bias, right? Especially as a data scientist, sometimes I will hear an opinion that's like, oh, you can't do that. And my first reaction is, well, why not? It's a fun thing. I want to go do it. Yes. But it's really stopping that reaction saying, well, why? Tell me your opinion. And that's very hard to do, especially in different cultures, or if you're not sure who you're talking to, maybe they are, above you in terms of the corporate ladder, but really just being open and saying, why? Tell me your opinion. I want to hear it. Because sometimes maybe it's hard for them to put into words why they think that is a bad idea. Or maybe it's easy. Or maybe they just have a gut reaction, which is absolutely fantastic, because you want to dig into that and hear what they have to say. And then you want to go and explore it. Then you want to shop it around and ask other people, right? And some people may not be comfortable with telling you, well, that's not really a good idea. Sometimes people will tell me, well, you're a data scientist, you should know. I'm like, I wish I was that good. Okay, I'm sorry. But I want to have that conversation with everybody because I want to hear the thoughts, and being able to solicit that across different teams, from our compliance, from legal, from our different data people who help us and sometimes are knowledgeable or equally are not knowledgeable, is very important for diversity.
And I want to call out one more point, and that's diversity, and that's class. So everybody in this room are probably all nice middle-class people, right? We all went to university and college, we're educated, we work in this field, and probably the people that we work with are kind of like us as well. But what tends to happen a lot of times is we want to use these AI systems, and we build these AI systems to police other people. And in a lot of cases, those people are from a different class. So I saw this a lot when I was working at the city, whether that's the literal police using AI algorithms or administering a social program. And so I think one of the weaknesses of companies and just kind of looking in their own circle is they don't necessarily get at this issue of socioeconomic class. And that's something that I think we need to be having, again, a concerted effort to bring in people that are not necessarily like us to have these different perspectives.
So I want to just jump in on that. So Google DeepMind wrote a 400-page excellent white paper on the ethics of advanced AI assistants. So these AI agents. And talking about class, to Katrina's point, they use a very simple example. They were trying to push this whole concept of using agents. So I want to set up a meeting with Ira, Katrina. So I'm just going to have my agent do it. My agent, I want to set up a dinner, right? So my agent's going to talk to my calendar. It's going to look at my availability and their calendar. It's going to look at my calendar and all my dietary restrictions, and then their dietary restrictions, and then use OpenTable, schedule something, and that's it. That's what an agent does. But they said, that sounds like a great idea, but guess what? People with access to calendars are going to only set up meetings with other people with calendars and technology. So implicitly, there's a class bias there, right?
Yep.
That's true. Never thought of it that way. So we're getting to the close of our this extraordinary panel. I got a couple more questions. One, what metrics or KPIs can be used to evaluate rather AI systems adhere to ethical standards? Are there any KPIs or metrics that can be used to kind of say, okay, yeah, we're hitting this metric or KPI so that now our system can be considered, falling into the ethical standards? Is there anything out there like that?
I wish. So for me, I work with a lot of metrics, right? How I determine something needs to go to production is because it hits a certain accuracy metric. It hits a certain fairness score, right? But when we think about ethics is a constantly evolving conversation. It doesn't make sense to put a number to a conversation that is meant to be a discussion. It is meant to expand and evolve. Maybe it goes backwards, maybe it's going forwards, but the goal is that it's a conversation, right? We may deploy something today that does not have an issue, and then tomorrow it has an issue, right? We may choose to use a feature that we don't think has any kind of bias or any kind of problem with fairness. And then, as that conversation, that cultural conversation continues, it then becomes, oh, hey, that is actually a problem. If we see that in the world of sports, right? How many teams have kind of changed their naming conventions because something is not appropriate today that was before. So as much as I would love to say, yes, pick this metric, it's super easy. It's inherently unethical, I think, to say that at the same time.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, so I don't think you can have off-the-shelf KPIs, but I do encourage you to come up with what those KPIs are going to be. So just by way of example, in one of my courses, I have this fictional company called the Landon Hotel. And this hotel wants to use an Alexa-like device in all of their guest rooms because it'd be so easy and you can order room service and do all these cool things with it. But they also have this value of respecting guest privacy. So what they're going to do, and they've kind of looked at the whole situation, is as they move forward to implement these devices, they're going to put in place a whole bunch of processes to help to respect guest privacy. And that looks a bit different for everyone. So for housekeeping, it looks like making sure the device is set to off unless a guest has turned it on. And then when they turn the room over for the next guest, they set it back to off. For people who are working in the IT department, it might mean erasing data. So these are the different steps that they're going to take. And then how would they evaluate the quality of that program as they go back and they look at, okay, did housekeeping do what they said they were going to do? Is IT doing what they said they were going to do? And so all of those things combined kind of lead to this bigger metric of being able to implement or live up to this idea of respecting guest privacy. So that's kind of a simple example, but I use that example because I think it's relatable, and it really speaks to this idea that you're going to have to do that hard work of figuring out what are the KPIs and metrics in your business and who do they apply to and what does that look like?
Wow, exactly. I like that. Okay, this is one last question. Get you guys to ponder on it a little bit. Uh, how should society address the potential economic and social impacts of AI, such as job displacement, environmental impacts? We talked a little bit about class and inequality. So, how should society address these potential and social impacts of AI?
Um, I think we don't know. I mean, if anyone says they know, that's a huge challenge. But from a regulatory perspective, Maryland is a good example. So they a lot of these states are have state level AI acts, but Maryland has an executive order that was passed in January of this year. And as part of that executive order, the governor asked for an assessment at the statewide level on how AI was going to impact workforce and was going to impact social development. So I don't think the governor had an answer, but the governor said, let's go explore it further.
I think
That's excellent.
yeah, that's the right answer. I think we're at another historic moment in life, right? We saw it with the Industrial Revolution, right? A lot of kind of the same technology came in and was a disruptor. People lost jobs, people retrained, but it was not an easy point. And I think it's a continuing conversation, and that things like the governor of Maryland did is the correct answer, right? Have that discussion. What does that impact look like? Who does that affect? What do we need to do? Do we need to do anything? Those are both very valid questions. And continuing to have that conversation is very important.
So at the macro level, right, we'll say globalization is a great idea, right? Globalization is a great idea. Maybe you get a lot of goods produced overseas because all of us then benefit from lower prices. But guess what? There's a lot of workers in certain parts of the country where the jobs got offshored. So they're not so happy. So that may happen with AI as well, right?
Exactly.
It might be a lot of white collar workers. It might be software engineers who may not have jobs. And maybe the next generation retools, but what do they do?
Yeah, I think another thing we can do is really demand better AI. I tell people that they can raise their consumer voices and ask for better. And in particular, generative AI is a bit of a nightmare. So we think about, where did all that training data come from? Well, it came from artists and writers and people who didn't agree to have their data in that training data set. There's lawsuits that are happening everywhere against OpenAI around that particular issue. We think about the fact that these are large language models that demand the creation of more and more data centers. Both Google and Microsoft are going to miss their environmental goals as a result of this. So do we actually need that? These are design decisions that have been made. And I think we as consumers, A, should be aware of that, and B, we should say, you know what, that's not good enough. We want you to do better. So I think that's part of the conversation as well. And then the last point I think about is really challenging some of this idea of optimizing everything. And I think that's really kind of what underpins a lot of this adoption. We're going to optimize everything. And I know, I'll wade into this topic, maybe a little bit politically charged, but given recent events, but Anthem Blue Cross came out about a week ago, maybe 2 weeks ago, and said, you know what, anesthesiologists, we know better than you do how long it should actually take for someone to be under during a procedure. So guess what? If you take 2 hours and 15 minutes when we think it should only be 2 hours based on our optimized data, we're actually not going to cover that procedure anymore. Now, they've walked this back as a result of the horrific things that have happened with United Healthcare and their CEO. But that's what I mean by this over-adoption of an optimization mindset. And AI is kind of at the heart of that. And I think that's something that we as a society also need to question.
Right. And I think the moral of that story is that we all have a voice. We are in control of what AI gets put out there. So, question?
Yeah, so one of the things that came out in the last 10 to 15 years was the Internet of Things. People were very concerned about security in the Internet of Things, right? Because it was a minimum viable product, and until the product was sold, you don't put any of the controls in. And now anybody, anywhere can create anything in terms of AI and turn it into a product. How are you seeing that reflected in regulations? For a lot of what I've heard here today has been more larger organization kind of impact, but it's, do we have an issue on the very small or low scale of AI adoption?
So you mean from a regulation standpoint? The regulations don't really say, at least the EU AI Act doesn't really takes a risk-based approach. It really doesn't take an, as far as I know, it doesn't take an organizational size-based approach. It takes a risk-based approach based on certain characteristics. One of them is recruitment. If you use AI for recruitment or use AI for biometrics, it's high risk. And certain types of AI, for example, predicting if someone is going to offend, that's going to be banned as of February last year. So, and many of the regulations in the US as well follow that approach. So I don't think just because you're a small organization you can get away. Now, it might be that you are not, in the EUA Act, you're not a provider of the AI system, you're a deployer of the AI system. So if you're a deployer of the AI system, you're still required to do some level of impact assessment, but you don't have the draconian requirements as a provider.
Yeah, even us in the general public and using ChatGPT and systems like that, you're creating your own GPTs that you may be selling or you may be utilizing for customers. I know OpenAI have you put policy and guideline information in those ChatGPTs. At the end of the day, if those systems are used for public consumption, you can be liable for lawsuits, especially if you don't have any of those things in those regulations or privacy guidelines or even understandings that written within the software itself. You can be sued, and that will be a big issue for the organization. So if you're not doing even the little guy, you still are opening yourself up for a lot of issues as that's concerned. And no one escape. And again, it's the users, it's the public that's using this software that have to speak up, that have to push back on the providers of this, and then do the things necessary to protect yourself in using this software. So I really am excited that we've had this discussion. I want to thank the panel. Fantastic insights. And I want to thank you guys for coming. I appreciate you guys' attention, and thank you to the panel.